850, or you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, we'd love you to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's start with the text question from Mo in Oxford. Why are 1 million Palestinians being shafted and nobody cares? The narrative seems to be so one-sided. Do you not think this is dangerous? Wendy Chamberlain.
I don't think the narrative is one-sided. I think anybody just needs to look back to the events of last Saturday and the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas to be profoundly shocked. But clearly what we are seeing in Gaza is a developing humanitarian situation. And in Parliament today, I think the Prime Minister, in fact, Davy, Keir Starmer, were all very clear that we need to address that. The government obviously announced aid that was going. The EU have done the same. And it's very clear that Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organisation. There are people in Gaza. We're already condemning the planned evacuation that the Israelis want to see happen. And it's really important. I would say, and if you heard my colleague Leila Moran today, she was in Parliament talking about her family who are directly impacted.
Palestinian.
She's Palestinian descent. She's a Christian Palestinian. I think those stories really demonstrate, like Hamza Yusuf, the First Minister's family, the real situation that people are dealing with. And I think we are calling out the Israeli government and ensuring that they behave, as Joe Biden said, as democracies would expect to behave in the light of the situation that they have experienced.
Andrea Leadsom.
Well, I absolutely agree with Wendy. I think each of the Prime Minister and the other party leaders today made very clear that Hamas' terrorist attack on Israel was totally unprovoked, and it was an attempt to destroy, to kill, to maim as many people as possible. And so Israel not only has the right, but also the duty to defend its people. And of course, the Prime Minister has spoken to Benjamin Netanyahu and has made clear absolutely our requirement that as much due cause is given to humanitarian issues as possible, and has had that absolute reassurance from the Israelis. But let's be clear, that was not reciprocated last Saturday during that unprovoked attack. And so the Prime Minister has had to make clear, as have other party leaders, that we stand by Israel. We stand by the Jewish people who have suffered so much. Hamas is also now responsible in big part for its actions in Gaza itself, where it is effectively telling people not to evacuate after Israel has said we will be coming back in to defend ourselves and you must evacuate. Hamas are telling people not to. So actually, Hamas is also not acting in the interests of Palestinian people, and that is absolutely shocking.
Why is it, do you think, that they still enjoy a lot of support among people in Gaza? I was reading about a poll at the weekend that showed that 49% of people in Gaza, 51% of people in the West Bank actually still support Hamas.
I mean, it is a terrorist organisation. It wants to wipe out the Jewish state. It is utterly abhorrent, and I cannot begin to think why people would want to take that approach, support that approach. But there is no doubt that there are innocent Palestinians, many millions of them, including over 1 million children, who are caught up in this horrifying situation, and they do not deserve it. And this is on Hamas, who are entirely responsible for what has happened, first in Israel and now for what's happening in Gaza.
Zoe Williams.
Well, to your point about the polling, you've got to bear in mind that it's effectively a totalitarian regime, Hamas. They haven't held elections since 2006 or 7, I think. So the idea that you can kind of poll the Palestinian people and they can give you a straight answer and that reflects their belief is like saying, why did people support Stalin? They supported Stalin because that bad things would happen to them if they did not support Stalin. Nevertheless, even if 90% of the Palestinian electorate supported Hamas, you still couldn't justify killing Palestinian children, which is what's happening, and it's happening everywhere. And it's happening on the convoys between the north and south. So as people take that evacuation order, move their families across completely destroyed roads. They're being bombed on the way to the place that doesn't have room for them.
Wasn't that disproved? I thought that was a methane lorry that exploded.
There have been numerous attacks on that convoy, numerous. And so that may have been a methane lorry, but it is absolutely unquestionable that there is an absolute massacre going on in Gaza at the moment. And obviously, I can see your listener's point. I think politicians were quite slow to catch up because the shock of the appalling events last Saturday was so intense that you were like, okay, whatever it takes. But actually, as you go into whatever it takes, it can't take a war crime. There's just it simply can't. There is no justification for war crime. That's why there are rules in war.
But just to come back on that, there is absolutely no accusation that Israel has committed war crimes. There isn't any evidence of war crimes, and Israel have been very clear that they will take the greatest care to abide by all international rules.
Well, the thing is,
you're
absolutely right. It's an unfolding situation, but certainly there was a very long period in which the electricity was cut off, water was cut off, lives were endangered. The evacuation zone that people have been told to evacuate contains the major hospital, which is overrun. It's an impossible situation for the disabled, for the mortally ill, for babies. Obviously, there's no way at this point you could say this crime has been committed, but it is incumbent upon the international community to say war crimes can't take place.
Which they have.
And I mean, to be fair, I can't think of another war situation, and that's what this is, where a country like Israel would actually give warning to the other side to move out because we are going to attack you.
No, you would always have to give warning. If you wanted to avoid...
Has Russia done that in Ukraine? I don't think so.
If you want to avoid the charge of a war crime, you have to show that you've taken measures to protect civilians, right? So unless you were going to say the whole of northern Gaza was only full of Hamas, which you can't say because 40% of the population are children, then of course they would have to give the evacuation order, but the evacuation order would have to be realistic.
Benedict.
To your question, which is why is Hamas popular, I would say the best example, the best comparison would be why is the Taliban very popular, which it is, and was very popular even under coalition rule, because it gets things done. Because actually it's very brutal, but it's very effective.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Well, I'm afraid this is the reality.
You want to be raped as a woman, if your children want to count for nothing.
Well, this is. I'm afraid all of you can sit here and you can all say, oh well, isn't it dreadful? But if the alternative is all of those things but nothing works, then actually yes, that is the option that you go for. If your options are you can have no rights as a woman, or you can have no rights as a woman and there is no electricity, you go for the one that is the slightly better option.
That is why. It's not getting things done in Afghanistan. People
it is absolutely. No, I'm sorry. It absolutely is getting things done. Just because it's not getting things done to the same extent that they do in Western countries does not mean that it is not sadly an effective form of government.
Really
but we're not actually talking.
Sorry, I know we're not. But
this is the thing. This is of course the thing. This is of course the thing is that we're comparing this to say a Western government, or maybe even to say the Pakistani government, which isn't really entirely fair, given that they get a lot more money and support from their allies. But ultimately, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about failed states who have very few options. And if your option is the one that enforces the law or the one that doesn't, you go for the one that enforces the law because it gives you a semblance of civilization. All of us can sit here and say, that sounds dreadful, but that ultimately is why these things are popular. But your point, the audience member's point, which is why are these people being, I can't remember the word, but they're being done over effectively, is because, broadly speaking, Hamas are the only Palestinian organisation that have offered a semblance of sane government. That is how they came to power in Gaza in the first place. And if you look at the alternatives, actually Palestinian politics, a bit like Lebanese politics, because I'm sure we're going to get to talk about Hezbollah at some point, it is a mess. It is an absolute sea of infighting organisations and a failure of any sort of attempt to form some sort of coalition. That is where you get extremist organisations filling the void in those situations.
Right, let's introduce another aspect to this from Sam in Cambridge. He says, as a Jewish person, I feel there's been a distinct lack of compassion for Israel in the light of the unprovoked attack by Hamas. Why does the panel think thousands of people marched in the recent Free Palestine rally, yet no such rally has been held to show support for Israel? Benedict?
I think because in this country we've never actually really properly come to terms with anti-Semitism in the way that some other countries have to. I think that it is, I mean, let's be clear. It
Like
is,
which?
Well, I think across some parts of Europe they had to face it. Certainly in Germany, they had to face it in a way that perhaps we haven't done because we didn't go through the same experience. But the problem is, of course, with anti-Semitism, it is not simply straight-up racism. It is multifaceted. It can inhabit all guises, be it religious, be it political ideology. It is a prejudice that manages to get itself into almost all aspects of life. It's very difficult, therefore, to eradicate, and it can sort of fester in what might seem quite benign ways that then flare up. And, I think you're seeing a lot of that actually with the people who are protesting for Palestine. A lot of the people who I think are chanting, for example, from the river to the sea, perhaps don't necessarily understand the racist connotations or the genocidal connotations behind that. That doesn't mean that they don't exist.
That's just excusing people who say they don't understand what the final solution means. They know damn well what that means.
I don't think that a lot of the students that you see, a lot of the young people who do not end up following through on these movements later on in life, I don't think actually that they are raging anti-Semites. I think that it is anti-Semitic what they're doing. I don't think that it is the case, though, that it is sort of inherently ingrained.
Okay.
Yes, but can I just ask you one thing?
No,
But this is for
you can't, because we haven't got much time left on this.
I'm actually going to ask you something.
Okay, sure.
But do you believe then that people who are worried about Palestine and who march for Palestine are explicitly anti-Semitic in that protest?
I just said that I don't think that they are. They might be parroting anti-Semitic tropes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are.
Honestly, I don't think. I don't think they're. I think genuinely that march was people, suing for peace.
So you don't think it was anti-Semitic at all?
Honestly, I mean, I wasn't.
What about the people with the glider pictures on the back of their rucksacks?
Whenever
What about the chance of death to Jews?
Yeah. I mean, the point is...
I mean, I don't...
The point is, can you imagine if, when Russia invaded Ukraine, suddenly people started protesting at Ukrainians in the streets of London?
Andrea, though,
but they think it's all right to do that with the Jews.
No, wait a second.
It's unbelievable.
Come on, we're getting very... It's not a perfect analogy.
Why?
Well, because the Ukrainians weren't about to invade Russia.
Yes,
and
they were. That's exactly what they were seeking to do, was to defend their country.
Just relax for a second. Ukraine has never invaded Russia. It's never cut off its electricity.
Intention.
It hasn't killed a lot of people.
Cross purposes. Russian intention. It wasn't Ukrainian.
No, exactly. But you drew the analogy.
I'm
right?
quite clear what I'm trying to say.
Wait a second. You drew the analogy. Russia invaded Ukraine. Can you imagine if anybody had then protested on Russia's side?
No.
Well, no, of course nobody ever would.
No, that's completely at cross purposes. What I'm saying is, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine needed to defend itself, i.e. that is a parallel with what Hamas did in Israel a week ago. Imagine if people in London started saying death to Ukrainians on our streets.
Well,
that's what you have now.
But actually, no, genuinely, I think that it would just be really useful to kind of take the heat out of the situation a little tiny bit and say there is a legitimate way to march for peace without being called.
Absolutely is.
And I don't think
that's what that was about. Come on.
I mean, obviously, if somebody on the march made an anti-Semitic chant, then they made an anti-Semitic chant.
Wendy.
Nobody's denying that.
But Iain, is part of the issue here from Sam's point is not necessarily that people did march for Palestine, but nobody is marching for Israel or for Jewish people, and it's that lack of compassion, as was on your calls before, cross questions about how we can't imagine what it's like about going to school.
It's open to any Jewish organisation to organise a march.
Yeah, and there have been statements.
And there has been rallies, but I think thinking about what you had obviously had on your For the Many podcast as well, is people feeling that nobody is reaching out to them, nobody's engaging with them, nobody's trying to understand what they are feeling. For example, can they go and practice their faith? Can their children go to school uninhibited? I think that is what Sam is getting at, rather than one, we shouldn't have marches, or two, everybody should march.
Right, we'll take more questions in just a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC.
A new
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
We are in the company of Andrea Leadsom, Zoe Williams, Wendy Chamberlain and Benedict Spence. Let's have one more question on Israel and Hamas before we move on to other subjects, because believe it or not, there are other subjects to talk about. And if you can think of any, do give us a call. Let's go to Claire in Edgware. Hello, Claire.
Good evening, Iain panel. Is it time to hand the entire Israel-Hamas catastrophe over to the United Nations Security Council and out of the hand of the Americans and the British, who talk about a two-state solution but do absolutely nothing to bring it about? How can we ensure that the Americans and the British do not veto the imposition of a two-state solution? And should Ehud Olmert be installed as interim Israeli Prime Minister?
Wasn't he convicted of a crime? Why do you think he should be installed? And you mentioned Britain and America, who are on the Security Council. There are 3 other members of it, you know.
I know, but I don't want the British will do what the Americans tell them to do. But I don't want anybody on the Security Council to veto it, because all we've heard all day long is, can somebody please ring in with a solution? Obviously, the British don't have one. The Americans, because they're so biased, can't have one. So hand it over to the UN Security Council.
Because you basically hate your own country and you hate America, so you think that they have no role to play here.
I don't hate America. I've got my
you're doing a bloody good
American.
impression of it. Just to tell you that on the Security Council at the moment, apart from these 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, China and Russia, the other countries, it's, by the way, chaired by Brazil at the moment. You've got Albania, Ecuador, Gabon, Ghana, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Switzerland and the United Arab Emirates. I think rather than hand it over to the Security Council, maybe just hand it over to Switzerland, Zoe.
I mean, everybody's scoffing a bit about how effective the UN could be and how many times it's not been effective in the past, and I completely get that. And I completely get that actually a two-state solution paths have failed in the past, and we've been a lot closer to them than we are right now, a lot closer. I mean, infinitely closer, and they've still failed. But there is one thing there was one development in the UN that happened last year, which was putting human security at the very kind of centre of their principles. Rather than human security is like a focus on basically don't kill anyone. Just, you know, if nations have a duty to protect their borders and municipalities have a duty to protect the law and order within those borders, the international community really is there to protect life and limb. It's there for pandemics, wars. It's there for imminent threat to life. And actually, if that's what the international community exists for, then the best way they execute that purpose is to be like full-on focused on making sure they prevent as much death as possible. And actually, I think that probably isn't a bad, because I think that really does rebuild. Like, at the moment, there's a huge sense in this conversation, as much as any other, that to have compassion for one side is to lack compassion for the other. To be destroyed by watching death on one side is to not care about death on the other. And if you had an international community that said, you know, human security is our first principle beyond anything else, and didn't start trying to wade in with instant political solutions, I think that would be emollient and it would be effective.
And it's perfectly reasonable to be idealistic, but I mean, you bring Hamas into that conversation, and it falls at the first fence.
Well, you'd need to talk to like a governance person about human security where it applies to terrorists. But
we know it doesn't, because all they want to do is kill people.
I know that that's a terrorist thing, and there's, you know, you cannot, as an international community or as an international organisation or institution, look at the most depraved acts in a situation and then adjust your expectations for yourself to those. I mean, you just can't do that.
Okay, Wendy?
I think at the heart of the issue I have with Claire's suggestion is the fact that then gives the UN Security Council permission to impose a two-state solution. I think out of everything that's happened, both in the immediate past and historically, any imposition of a solution is not a solution. It's quite clear that whatever happens in the coming days, weeks and months, that the need for a two-state solution is more critical than it has ever been. But for any imposition to take place, I think that is doomed to failure.
Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, that is the reality of it, isn't it? Is you cannot impose something. You can impose it for a period of time, but then the day you leave is the day that individuals who don't agree with it go back to what they were doing before. I always remember visiting Jerusalem with my family and just looking at the incredible, complex web of arguments and disagreements over hundreds and hundreds of years. Those things can't just be resolved with an imposition by a group of UN people, because who gives them the right? You know, this is a fundamental problem. So, and exactly as Iain says, this stops the second you introduce a terrorist group into the subject. Any chance of conversation stops, because all they want to do is to kill people.
And also, Claire, I don't know if you've got an example of an international agreement that's been imposed on countries where that's ever actually worked out in the end. I can't honestly think of one off the top of my head. Maybe others can.
No, I think something sits very awkwardly with me about the idea of the international community telling the world's only Jewish state what it can and cannot accept, given that it is the country that is continuously invaded by its neighbours. It is the one that has to be pushed back. And let's be clear, that is why Britain and the United States and others are very supportive of Israel, because they recognise that if it was left to the international community, Israel might not exist quite as long as people would like. I actually happen to think that the direction that things are going in the region are, before this kicked off, and actually I do think partly as a result of this, might be a little bit more positive than people tend to think. The attitude now towards the current Israeli government is very hostile, because they are seen as being asleep at the wheel. The right-wing elements in particular, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, they are being blamed on the ground for having their priorities in the wrong places.
And Netanyahu.
And Netanyahu especially. That's the key thing. And so I do think once this is all done, and I don't want to sort of speculate too long on what that's going to involve, I do think there will be a desire for political change in Israel. That could be very positive. We also need to recognise that as much as this might have been done to sort of throw a spanner in the works of the Abraham Accords, I don't think actually that the ones that have already signed the agreements, Bahrain, Morocco, the UAE, they are not interested in tearing up their agreements. They have been very vociferous in some areas of condemning Hamas. I also don't think Saudi Arabia believes that it is in its self-interest to just go, right, well, that's it. Israel is invading Gaza. We'll have nothing more to do with it. So you're beginning to see a coalescing of Arab states that want peace there as well. And once I think you get that sort of critical mass, and you have a lot of influence in those countries on the Palestinian Authority, on the different various factions there, you are more likely to find a peaceful solution than if you just throw it to the United Nations and you say it to Gabon or Japan.
Is it a conspiracy theory too far to suggest that the timing of this was orchestrated by Iran to scupper the Israeli-Saudi deal?
I don't think it was Iran.
Yeah, I think it was Russia.
I think Hamas.
I think Russia's got money in it.
I don't think Russia. I think Russia does benefit, but I don't think it's by design. China benefits, but it's not by design. And Iran, I don't think really does benefit, because as we've seen, actually, the United States is moving carrier groups to the region. Iran can fight a war against Israel. It can't fight a war against the United States.
No, you can't, because you're going to forget what you asked, and I won't be able to answer you.
I just said go ahead.
Okay, well, you said, can you think of a situation where any country has had two states imposed on it? And I can actually. Germany, after the end of the Second World War, I mean, it was divided into East and West Germany by the international community. Yeah, I mean, it's like, it doesn't work, but it does happen.
I was thinking more at the end of the First World War.
It does happen. It happens all the time.
Can I just remind everyone, how is Israel ever going to say, yeah, sure, let's just move on?
Sure.
How does that happen? Notwithstanding the desire for peace and maybe political change and maybe, but Israel must feel absolutely under threat. This was the biggest loss of life since the Holocaust. This is outrageous. This is babies having their throats cut, people being raped and burned alive. This is shockingly barbaric. How could you feel safe if you're an Israeli or indeed a Jew?
But can I just ask you because the thing is that you can, and I've heard Northern Irish peace movements say exactly the same thing. You can lock into a place where you can never. Wait, there's no moving on from it.
Yeah, but
I know. I'm not saying move on now. I'm not saying this is let's everybody draw a line under it. I'm saying that actually there is, if the logical end point of how do you ever move on is to say one of the states has to be obliterated, and I don't think you can say that.
There is a great difference with the Northern Ireland situation, where in the end the IRA came to the conclusion that they could never win militarily, and so they made a decision that they would come to the negotiating table. Now, I can't ever see Hamas or Hezbollah doing that. I just can't. But I hope I'm wrong.
But the Palestinians more broadly might come to, and that is sadly where it then becomes a question of Israel has decided that this is the moment to go after Hamas. If you are able to get rid of Hamas, then one of the major obstacles to peace...
But then you have to have leadership from Fatah, and that isn't there at the moment.
Well, as again I said, that is why there is popularity for people who offer alternatives to Fatah. You know, it is not too much of a stretch, but it is not impossible that may emerge.
They need some sort of Mandela figure, a unifying figure that can come and actually unify the Palestinian people.
Part of the reason that these, this stable government you talk about they don't have, these leaders that you talk about they don't have, is because ever since Hamas became a designated terrorist organisation, the country has been operating under boycotts, which means that not only is there kind of zero import and export because of the relations between
that's
Israel
because
and
it's
Gaza.
a terrorist.
No, wait.
The Palestinian Authority, there isn't the leadership either.
No,
they're supposed to be the moderates.
But the reason that governance doesn't exist is because there has been no legitimate trade or money for the country. So all the money coming in is
Hamas will break your arm if you wear Fatah colours to school.
That is the argument that people make.
They are terrorising their own people in Palestine.
I know, but you're not.
They're embedding their terrorists in hospitals and places where innocent people are.
That is the argument that people have made for doing business with Iran. And all that has happened is Iran has funded other groups around the region.
You're just not hearing me. What I'm saying to you is if there's no legitimate trade with the country, if there's no legitimate funding into the country, if the country is operating under boycotts, if the only money that comes in is from aid packages, which doesn't actually go to institutions of government, but goes to other aid agencies, then you do not get a mature building, governance and institutional system. And then to sit there and go, oh, why don't they have better leaders? Why don't they have political parties? Why don't they have better democracy? When they haven't had a public vote since 2007 and when they've been under boycott since shortly afterwards.
I'm not just saying that about Gaza, I'm saying it about the West Bank.
I know, but I just wish that you would just be a bit more realistic rather than saying, oh, why is this country such a mess? I can't imagine.
OK. Right, we're going to move on from this subject after the news. It's 8:32 news headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
The Prime Minister is asking Israel to do all it can to avoid harming civilians in its expected invasion of Gaza. The UK has announced an extra £10 million in aid for Palestinians. The Justice Secretary says the prison service will be allowed to move some less serious offenders out of prison and onto licence up to 18 days before their release date. Alex Chalk says it's to help ease prison overcrowding in England and Wales. And Conservative MP Peter Bone is facing a suspension from the House of Commons. A panel's found he committed acts of bullying and one of sexual misconduct a decade ago. Allegations, he says, are false. LBC weather mostly dry overnight with the chance of some frost, a low of -1.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:36, at the behest of several of you on text and Twitter, I have urged our panel not to talk over each other because it means that you don't know who's speaking. On our panel tonight, we have Andrea, Leadsom, Zoe Williams, Wendy Chamberlain and Benny? I don't know where that came from. Benny from Crossroads. Benedict Spence. Right, an Alexa question here from Nikki in Tunbridge Wells. Why does it take so long for alleged wrongdoings in and around Parliament to be investigated? Are MPs being treated differently from us mere mortals? Now, this is on the news today, as you just heard in the news there, that Conservative MP Peter Bone is facing a 6-week suspension from Parliament after an investigation upheld allegations of bullying and sexual misconduct, which the complainant says happened more than a decade ago. This complaint was made 2 years ago, with a previous and unresolved complaint made to the Conservative Party 6 years ago. Peter Bone denies any wrongdoing. Now, this is serious in that he could face now a recall petition, which means that there would then be yet another by-election in his constituency of Wellingborough. Now, you were leader of the House of Commons and you set up some of these procedures, I think, Andrea.
Yeah.
Just take us through what's happened here.
Yeah, I mean, this is yet another example of a process that's just been abysmally implemented. So, yes, I set up this thing called the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme. It was a cross-party scheme, all parties represented and all signed up to it. And the idea of it was that it would be confidential, essentially to the alleged victim, because very often people won't come forward with complaints because they don't want that media spotlight that they immediately get. So it would be confidential for the victim and obviously the alleged perpetrator. It would be swift and it would provide justice, as is now the case here. The problem with it is it has become mired in really non-relevant complaints, so things that are around work contracts and so on, because the House hasn't established a proper HR department for member staff. So basically it's taking far, far too long, like years too long, to actually investigate a complaint and uphold or reject it. And that's what's happened in this case. But added to which, as you said, the original complaint was made to the Conservative Party. All of the political parties upgraded their complaints procedures following that Me Too Westminster scandal back in 2017-18, and those processes now work much faster, but I cannot explain why this took so long to come to some sort of decision. But it's good to see that it has finally come to a decision today. And, you know, clearly justice delayed is justice denied, and so for the person who has gone through all this, no doubt they will be relieved today, but astonished that it's taken so long, as am I. And just to finish off my story, I'm actually planning to seek a backbench debate on the implementation of the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, precisely because it is taking far too long.
18 months ago, Jane Merrick from the newspaper reported that 56 MPs were accused of sexual misconduct. I mean, that's 8% of all parliamentary seats. And what's happened to all of those 56?
So Jane Merrick cannot possibly know that. And this is one of the other things that is a real concern to me, is that the ICGS, as I say, ended up taking up complaints like, you know, I was made to work late, things which would be a normal workplace grievance. And because there isn't a proper HR department, people take it to the ICGS instead. So what the ICGS does is it is totally confidential. It reports quarterly on the total number of complaints, and it may well be that it reported quarterly that there were 56 complaints against MPs. That does not mean they were sexual harassment complaints, and nobody in the public, me, you, none of us, even the person who runs the scheme, would not know what those complaints are about, because it's strictly confidential, and those resolutions are carried out by independent caseworkers. So it's simply nobody knows how many complaints there are, and I would say it'll be a handful, but unfortunately it's completely overloaded with workplace complaints, which the Speaker has tried to change by creating more of a kind of HR department for MP staff and some of the other 15,000 staff and people who come to work in the Houses of Parliament.
Wendy?
I think The question from Nikki was about mere mortals. And the reality is, I think there's two aspects to that here. Frankly, MPs are mere mortals and we deserve to be held account for bad behaviour when it happens. But I think the other aspect is, and this is where the complexity comes into play, is we are not employees. You know, I'm chief whip for my party. I'm nobody's line manager. I have been voted by my constituents into my role, and only my constituents can...
Chief whip, you can impose discipline.
Yes, and I suppose the issue here is, and this is where I think there is the serious questions for the Conservatives to answer in terms of what went wrong with their process. Now, I'm not going to pretend that any party process is easy or straightforward, but clearly what has happened in this situation is the person has not received a satisfactory outcome from the Conservative complaint process, and then has come to the ICGS after an extended period of time. But we have had circumstances, and this is where the lack of consistency is a real problem, where you have somebody like David Warburton, the former MP for Somerton and Frome, who, when allegations were made against him, and indeed that was in the media, lost the whip immediately. But here we have Peter Bone this evening facing a 6-week suspension. He's not lost the whip.
Dare I mention the words Mike Hancock to you?
Well, absolutely, and this is where I always say that, you know, all the parties, frankly, need to do a whole load better on this. But there's absolutely no doubt that we have to accept at the moment that there is a run of cases that are affecting one party. And I suppose what I would say in response to Andrea, and I say this having been part of the Speakers' conference, which was looking specifically at the most recent allegations, is I think we are seeing a lot of cases now coming through the independent expert panel, and that can only be a good thing. But that doesn't absolve MPs or political parties in any way. But
are they sort of the more serious kind, or are they sort of slightly frivolous?
Well, the independent expert panel is where MPs have complained about the initial outcome, and then that report comes to the floor of the House. If I think of any of the independent expert panel responses of late, they have been serious in their offences.
OK. Benedict?
The expression that both of you used was mere mortals, and I think we do need to remember that. It's not just in terms of whether or not people are held to account, but the process itself, as this is an evolving process, as is the nature of parliamentary democracy. You're always going to have sort of bumps in the road. You're going to encounter problems that nobody perhaps foresaw, that you will have to sort of come to down the line. You know, you might have a changing nature of offences, or changing nature of how people interact with each other, changing natures of how people are employed. The issue, I suppose, comes when you come out with a figure like that. For example, 8% of MPs, not under investigation for serious sexual misconduct necessarily, but that there are complaints being made against them at all. That is still a rather large number for complaints of any sort of variety to be ongoing at any one time. And I suppose really the issue is, given that it is the very unusual nature of the role that MPs fulfill, there is this demand for perfection and also for transparency, which of course I think clashes with the idea of the fact that often complaints have to be confidential. So you get this sort of these sort of twin competing needs, where you need to be completely straight with your constituents, because your constituents need to be able to judge you based on your activities. But at the same time, you also have a duty both to victims, to complaints, but also to MPs themselves whilst the process is ongoing. It is very difficult, and I think that perhaps constituents should just be very aware of that and very tolerant of the fact that it is an imperfect system, but that it can only improve over time.
Julian says, Mr. Dale, you can come across as being quite reasoned and reasonable, but this evening that facade is definitely shaky. Let Zoe Williams finish her point for once. The floor is yours, Zoe Williams, for the rest of the programme without interruption.
It just seems peculiar that you would spend so much time talking about Peter Bone without any of us getting to chat about what he actually did or which accusations were upheld.
Within the laws of libel, feel free.
I don't want to. I want you to start. I mean, like...
You want me to interrupt you?
Well, the accusations sounded quite... The workplace bullying accusations sounded quite intense, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, like, he sounds like a very peculiar man who shouldn't ever have had a member of staff until he learnt how to be somebody's employer. He sounds like he was acting like a kind of 19th century head teacher in a really, really bad school. I mean, is that fair?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the first I knew of these accusations were when I read about it in the papers today. I mean, Andrea, I don't know if you want to You work with
I agree.
Peter. I
No.
mean, he's been on this. He was on this programme a couple of weeks ago. I've always found him to be very good company, but I don't work for him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a kind of. I mean, I think there's the kind of wider point is I think part of the reason it takes it so long, and I know I don't know anything like as much about the actual process as you guys do, is that there's no kind of sliding scale. There's either complete disgrace or complete exoneration, and actually a lot of this stuff needs a bit more of a sliding scale.
I think one of the accusations did involve flashing.
It's a sexual misconduct where it was a case of indecent exposure.
But I mean, I'm sure that's the one that got him the suspension. But there was loads of other stuff that was upheld, even if it wouldn't have got him suspended, including that he used to make that researcher sit with his hands in his lap when he'd misbehaved.
But we're laughing, you see.
No, I mean, I'm not laughing. I think that's really weird, controlling behaviour. No, I'm laughing at Peter Bone. I'm not laughing at the guy.
But Iain, if I can just come in there, this is where it comes back to that bit of the power dynamic that exists in Parliament. I've said I should be treated as a mere mortal as an MP, but the power dynamic is
I know, but look, there is a
we
real.
absolutely shouldn't laugh.
No, but the problem is not us laughing. The problem is the kind of absolute catastrophic lack of professionalism amongst MPs, and no offence, but amongst Conservative MPs in particular. There have been all these cases, and the sexual misconduct cases get onto the front pages because they're the juiciest. But there have been loads and loads of these.
The risk of being accused of interrupting you, there are plenty of Labour examples as well. It's not just restricted to the Conservative Party.
I don't see a lot of the by-elections happening as a result of Labour misdemeanour.
That's because one or two of them. I mean, if you think, I still don't know.
I'm not partisan.
What Nick Brown is accused of, but he's had the whip withdrawn a year ago, and nobody knows what's going on with that case. Now, I don't know whether there'll be a by-election at the end of it. I don't know what the accusations are, but it seems a bit odd. And then you had. Wasn't there a Hartlepool by-election as a result of what the Labour MP had done there?
Yeah,
I think there was.
There was.
But I mean, look, it happened. Let's just agree. It all happens in all parties.
No, I won't just agree, because there has been a really bizarre dishevelment in the culture of Parliament since Boris Johnson's election. You know, the porn and the tractor, the kind of persistent failure of the leader to do anything about complaints that were really quite serious. That's effectively what brought down that short prime ministership. So, I'm not prepared to do they're all kind of the same, because I don't think they are.
Okay.
Can I just say, however, that this ICGS, which has resulted in some extremely high-profile justice being meted out, which is a good thing, good for our Parliament, but actually it wasn't the only thing that we did. And again, this is cross-party, so credit to all parties for wanting to resolve this. We also created something called a behaviour code, which effectively creates a whole code around treating everybody you come across with dignity and respect, whether you're an MP, whether you're somebody who's cleaning, whether you're someone who's working for an MP, if you're someone who's sorting out the IT, whoever it is, there's a very clear behaviour code. And that is also taking time to come to fruition. Right. We also had a whole set of training, which unfortunately a lot of long-standing MPs were like, yeah, I'm not doing that. But actually it was very seriously about treating others equally and fairly. Yeah. And actually I did the training, I'm sure you did, Wendy, and it was extremely helpful and actually really interesting, because none of us are aware of our unconscious bias, otherwise it wouldn't be unconscious bias. So there's actually a whole load of stuff that we recommended that hasn't actually happened properly. So I do commend to you my backbench debate on the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme. We're going to make things better.
We'll cover it live on LBC News.
Oh, wow.
Or possibly LBC News, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, we should repeat that Peter Bone denies any wrongdoing at all here. He will no doubt have his say when it comes to the floor of the House of Commons. I assume that's when he will...
No, he won't. He won't. No, we don't allow people, the person who is there to be accused to speak. The independent panel's paper will come to Parliament for a final vote. And in case people are sort of then going to say, oh, you'll vote it down, that hasn't ever happened yet. I don't expect that it will. And very importantly, the reason why it comes to Parliament for a vote is because ultimately somebody who's been elected needs to only be removed by elected peers. It's a fundamental principle of democracy.
And one of the other things, and this is actually something that when the MP's Code of Conduct was reviewed, it was an amendment I took forward. If we think back to Owen Patterson, he voted against his own suspension, but that now cannot be the case. An MP cannot vote in relation to their own suspension.
Peter Bone has posted a statement on Twitter bemoaning that he's unable to respond to it in any other way. Well, if you'd like to come and respond on this programme, Peter, you'd be very welcome to. It's 10 to 9.
LBC.
Get up.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
I'll never put fat jokes in my films again, says Richard Curtis, after criticism from his daughter. That's what we're going to talk about after 9. Are we in danger of losing our sense or right to a sense of humour, is the question I'm going to put to you. But first, a text question from Ray in Bracknell. Is there any point in sending someone to prison for a couple of months? Now, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, has admitted England and Wales prisons are completely full, so some lower-level offenders will be given community service instead, while some current prisoners will be released on licence 18 days before the end of their sentence, and foreign offenders currently in prison will be deported to their home countries sooner than normal. Well, that last one seems a bit odd. You'd have thought they would want to do it as soon as possible anyway. Benedict?
Obviously, it depends on the nature of your offence, whether or not it's worth sending somebody to prison for a few months. But broadly, this is an infrastructure problem. It's tied up, I suppose, in the fundamental role of the state. But we're seeing this generally speaking when it comes to things like energy provision, when it comes to reservoirs. Actually, the population continues to expand, and infrastructure investment doesn't keep pace with it. Old stuff is decommissioned and it isn't replaced. And I think that's really what you've kind of got with the criminal justice system. There has also been an uptick in the number of people being given longer sentences. So when you combine those two things, obviously you get a bottleneck. I do believe sending people to prison for long stretches in some circumstances is very useful. But of course, for that, you need excess capacity. You cannot run a prison system based on the idea that you're constantly just at the crest of the wave and you hope that there isn't a spike or that a prison wing doesn't get decommissioned. And this is due to a real lack of planning, I think, and it goes all the way back to the coalition government. Actually, the MOJ was the there was the ministry that was hit harder than any other, relatively, when it came to government cuts. And when I think of what a government is actually for, what I think of what a state is actually for, above anything else, NHS, education, whatever it is upholding law and order and your rights. So for a government to actually do that, to decide that that department is the one that we can cut the most, I think is a real dereliction of duty, especially given that it's been on the watch of a Conservative government.
Zoe?
It's not quite right, because the main people who were hit by the coalition austerity measures were local authorities, who are, of course, in charge of so much.
As a general
social care to,
ministry.
but you're really seeing right now, councils go bust, prisons go bust, prisons not go bust, but like basically run out of capacity. And that was warned about 5 years ago and actually plotted pretty exactly. The MOJ were informed that it would be at this point in 2023, that they ran out of places. Now, the point is not, can we live without short sentences? Because I'm sure if you did really experimental things around restorative justice and community orders and all the rest of it, then you probably could live without short sentences. The point is that we're completely losing control of the civic structures of law and order. So it's not just that there aren't any prison places. It's not just that there is about to be a system in which people aren't going to be able to have short sentences. There's kind of conviction rates, there's cases going through the CPS, cases coming before judges. It's all going off a cliff. The backlogs are extraordinary. Rape convictions are so low now that it has effectively been decriminalised. We're watching what happens to a system when you underfund it for 13 years. And it really isn't pretty.
Wendy?
So the question is there any point in sending someone to prison for a couple of months? If you're sending somebody to prison for a short sentence, the focus surely is on rehabilitation, not punishment.
We should say you speak as a former police officer.
I do speak as a former police officer. So for me, a couple of months, no, because you're not going to actually have the time to intensively engage in the rehabilitation processes that are taking place. And what we are seeing here, and this is where I agree with the other panellists, is we're seeing another U-turn from the Conservatives in relation to short sentences. In 2019, Robert Buckland agreed with the Justice Select Committee who was looking at short sentences. Then it wasn't the Conservative manifesto, and now Alex Jock is saying today that he wants to reduce short sentences. So we're seeing that U-turn, but we're seeing that U-turn not because we actually want to reduce crime and rehabilitate offenders. We're seeing it because the criminal justice system is creaking, and the capacity in prisons is just a part of that.
Andrea?
Well, that was very anti-conservative and peppered with fake facts on the part of Zoe and, sadly, Wendy as well. And the fact is that it's very clear that short sentences don't work, and that the reoffending rate is twice as high amongst those who have short sentences. It's something like 50% versus 25% amongst those who have longer sentences. Now in our country, we have the average sentence is now over 9 years, whereas it used to be around 3 years. And certainly in the most horrendous crimes of rape, murder, allowing a child to die, terrorism offences, sentences are longer, and criminals are being forced to serve their whole sentences, not let out early. However, technology has also changed the ability to hold on for short sentences and for repayment to communities and to society using electronic tags and so on. And what the Justice Secretary is talking about is using better methods of restorative justice at the same time as punishing appalling criminality much harder. And by the way, the government's committed to 20,000 new prison places and has delivered 5,000 of those already, with another 5,000 due by May 25.
OK, let's go to our fun question for the end of the programme from Carly in Dagenham. Madonna is back out on tour and has been performing in London at the age of 65, only months after she was so ill that she ended up in intensive care. I'm so excited to see the Queen of Pop later this week. That's Carly, not me. Which music legend would you drop everything to see, Zoe Williams?
I probably would drop everything to see Leonard Cohen.
That was unexpected. Okay. Benedict?
I'm going to see The Prodigy next month, actually. That's always who I drop everything to go and see, is The Prodigy, which is slightly unexpected, I think.
Wendy?
That is slightly unexpected.
I saw Blur in July, but I have to say I did enjoy meeting Brian May from Queen in Parliament. We shared hair care tips.
I wasn't going to say anything.
That's so cool. Do you play the guitar?
Andrea?
Well, you said drop everything for, so I immediately thought of Neil Diamond for no particular reason, but Yeah, you won't let me choose Elvis because you said it has to be someone.
You could choose the British Elvis, of course, Cliff Richard, who I will be performing on stage with at the Hammersmith Apollo in November for 3 nights. No, I won't be singing. I'd love to sing Miss Unites with Cliff Richard.
What are you actually going to do?
Interview him. He's doing a concert, but instead of doing 2.5 hours of songs, it's going to be sort of 80 minutes of songs and 40 minutes of me interviewing him about his life.
Oh my God, that's a new format.
I think you should come and review it.
I probably will.
You probably will, won't you? I think all tickets have been sold, though. What a shame. Right, thank you very much indeed to Andrea Leadsom, to Zoe Williams, Wendy Chamberlain and Benedict Spence. Coming up in the next hour, Richard Curtis has promised never to make fat jokes in his work again after being taken to task by his daughter. The writer of 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Notting Hill and Blackadder says he now feels bad about lines in his films which are no longer funny. If you think about it, there are so many programmes that couldn't be made now. At Little Britain, for example, all of the sketches I think of for Little Britain, which we all found hilarious at the time, you just couldn't make anymore. Are we in danger of losing a sense of humour almost by force? I'm not going to use the word woke, but there are aspects to this that really make me fear for our future senses of humour. Or am I being stuck in the mud? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. Rishi Sunak says at least 6 British citizens have been killed in attacks by Hamas and that a